All right, so we are in the I Survived the American Revolution story of 1776. Specifically, we are going to be reading chapters 4, 5, and 6 today. We'll pick up where we left off with Nate in chapter 4 on page 19. Nate's mind swirled. He was afraid he might vomit. It wasn't Storch's moans of pain that sickened him. It was knowing what would happen to Theo. Storch would sell him for sure. Eliza would lose him forever, just like she'd lost her husband Gregory. Nate rushed over to Theo, who was trying to hide behind the cherry tree. Nate lifted Theo up and hugged him close. Eliza was on the porch now, bending down to help Storch. Eliza looked up. She spotted Nate and Theo. Her eyes locked with Nate's, and in that split second, Nate could see she understood exactly what had happened. Nate had to get Theo out of here. "Don't worry," Nate whispered to Theo. "I won't let anything happen to you." But Nate's words seemed to scatter in the wind. Of course, he couldn't just run off with Theo. Theo wasn't just any little boy. He was a slave. To Storch, Theo wasn't even a person. He was valuable property. Storch wouldn't just let him go. He'd hire slave catchers. He'd offer a fat reward. He'd never stop looking. There was nothing Nate could do to help Theo. Unless... An idea flickered in Nate's mind like a little flame. Storch hadn't seen Theo throw the stick, had he? His back had been turned. What if Nate could trick Storch into thinking someone else had thrown the stick? Then Theo would be safe. Nate put Theo down. "Run behind the barn," Nate whispered. "Never tell anyone what happened with that stick." "You come, too," Theo said, clinging to Nate's arm. Soon Nate said, struggling to keep his voice steady. He hated lying to Theo, but he had no choice. Theo turned and dashed away. Nate stood up. With clenched fists and shaking legs, Nate made his way to where Storch was now sitting up. Eliza was pressing a rag to his bleeding head. "I'm sorry, sir," he said. "It was an accident. The stick slipped from my hand." "Nate," Eliza whispered. Storch struggled to his feet, glaring at Nate with fury. If Storch's eyes had been cannons, they would have blasted Nate into the sky. He lunged forward. Smack! He slapped Nate across the face. Nate staggered back. His face felt like he had been scalded with boiling water. Tears sprang into Nate's eyes, tears of relief. That slap meant Storch believed him, that Theo was safe, at least for now. But Nate was not. Storch lunged forward and grabbed Nate by the throat. His hands were like iron claws. With his bulging eyes and blood-smeared face, Storch looked like a sea monster from Nate's worst nightmares. Nate struggled but couldn't break free from the choking grip. Eliza screamed, but the voice inside Nate's mind screamed louder. "He's going to kill me." With his last ounce of strength, Nate whipped his arm up and bashed his fist into the side of Storch's head. Storch lost his grip and fell back. Nate took one last look at Eliza. "Go," she mouthed. Nate turned and ran. Chapter 5. July 12th, 1776. Just before dawn, Norwalk, Connecticut. Nate's eyes snapped open. Hideous pictures flashed through his mind. A blood-streaked face, claw-like hands grabbing for his throat. He blinked hard to end this nightmare, to shake himself awake, but then Nate understood. He was awake. He was hiding out in the woods, about 3 miles from Storch's house. There is where he'd wound up after his breathless run. He'd sat here under the trees for hours, in a kind of numb shock, trying to figure out what to do. Somehow he must have fallen asleep. It was now pitch dark. Strange sounds rose up around him. Clicks and buzzes and hoots. The rustling of invisible wings and paws. His jaw throbbed. His neck felt swollen and bruised, but even worse was the loneliness. He felt like a castaway clinging to a barrel in a stormy ocean. He'd made a giant mistake, he realized, fighting back tears. He had to go back to Storch's, to Eliza and Theo. He stood up and started to make his way through the woods. Storch would be calmer now, Nate told himself, and whatever Storch might do to him, he'd have to take it, because what choice did he have? He didn't have a single coin in his pocket or a scrap of food to eat. He was just a boy alone in the world. But then as Nate walked along, he thought about another boy who had once been by himself, the pirate Slash O'Shea. Nate slowed down as he remembered the stories Papa had told him about when Slash was a kid. He had been born in London, England. His parents had died before he was 5 years old. He wasn't called Slash yet. Back then he was called Jonathan. With his parents gone, he wound up in a filthy orphanage, more like a prison than a home for helpless kids. The food was barely fit for pigs. The beatings were brutal. Finally, young Jonathan couldn't take it. When he was 10 years old, he ran away. He must have been terrified, Nate thought, like Nate was now. But there was no way he'd go back to that wretched orphanage. Jonathan got himself a job on a ship as a cabin boy. He'd sailed away, and he was never looked back. Nate pictured a boy standing on the deck of a big sailing ship. The boy's face became clear until it became Nate's own face. Nate blinked. Something inside him shimmered. Suddenly the night didn't seem so dark. If young Slash could go to sea, why couldn't he? Sure, Nate was too young. Papa wouldn't hire cabin boys who were younger than 14. But Nate was bigger and taller than most 11-year-olds. And Papa had taught him to work harder than sailors twice his age. Nate quickened his step as he made his plan. New York City was about 50 miles south of here. He'd go to Norwalk Harbor. There were always boats heading down to New York City, loaded up with vegetables or oysters or hogs to sell. Nate would hide out on one of those boats. If the winds and currents were strong, he would be in New York City by the afternoon. The city had one of the busiest harbors in the colonies, with merchant ships heading to the Caribbean and Europe and all corners of the world. There had to be at least one captain willing to give Nate a chance. Nate could practically feel Papa's hand on his back pushing him along. He saw Theo in his mind with his bright and hopeful eyes, and remembered the last word Eliza had said to him. Go. He made it to the harbor several hours later. The docks were already crowded with sailors and fishermen preparing for the day, and for once Nate lucked out. At the end of the dock was the sailing ship Valerie. It made weekly runs to New York City. Nate knew. And its deck was already loaded up with baskets and crates heaped with corn and potatoes and cherries. The sails were up. The ship was about to leave. There were only 3 men working on the small ship. They were too busy working to notice when he slipped on board. He scurried across the deck and hid himself between 2 big baskets of corn. A few minutes later, sailors pushed the boat away from the dock, and with a whoosh of wind, Nate was on his way. Chapter 6. Nate stayed very still in his hiding place. His empty stomach churned with worry. Panicked thoughts spun around his brain. Would he ever see Theo and Eliza again? What if Eliza had to do all of Nate's work now? How would she watch over Theo? The rocking of the ship calmed him some. He listened to the familiar sounds, the swoosh crack of the sails, the creak of wood, the twang of the sailors' voices. Bright pictures filled up his mind, memories of visiting New York City with Papa. Some of their voyages had started from there, and Papa always left a day or two for them to explore before they set sail. New York City wasn't as big as Philadelphia, but it had 25,000 people. 25,000. That was more people than Boston or Charleston. New York was dirty and smelly like every city Nate had ever visited. Garbage rotted in the alleys, piles of horse dung steamed in the streets. But Papa always said New York was the prettiest city of the colonies, and Nate agreed. The wide streets were lined with tall elm trees. Gardens were bursting with sweet-smelling flowers that almost covered up the garbage stink. Nate loved the sidewalk puppet shows and jugglers who spun torches on the street corners. Papa would tip his cap at the ladies swishing by in their bright dresses. Best of all was the food. Suppers of juicy rabbit stew and gooey boiled puddings and buttery dumplings that slid down Nate's throat. One restaurant was so fancy they actually gave Nate and Papa each a fork. A fork! Even most rich people like Storch ate with a knife in their fingers, but Nate and Papa figured out that strange new tool pretty quick. Nate's mind flashed with memories of Papa as the Valerie sailed down the twisting coastline of Connecticut and New York. He shut up his grumbling stomach by sneaking a few ears of corn. The sun was high in the sky when they came to Manhattan, the island of New York. Most of the long and skinny island was wild land, rolling green hills and forests, and marshes with just a few orchards and farms. It looked so quiet and peaceful. It was hard for Nate to imagine that busy New York City was just a few miles down on the island's southern tip. But slowly the city came into view. Nate spotted crooked rooftops, the wharves jutting into the river, and too many church steeples to count. The Valerie sailed toward the bottom of the island and turned into one of the wharves. Nate didn't bother waiting until the Valerie was completely stopped. The moment it was close to the dock, he sprang up. With a few steps and a leap, he was off the boat. One of the Valerie's sailors swore in surprise as Nate streaked past him, but Nate was gone before anyone could stop him. He ran down the dock, zigzagging around baskets and barrels and coils of ropes. There were only a few dock workers milling around, and no big merchant ships. That was a little strange. Last time there were too many ships to count. The docks had been packed with sailors from all over the world, lugging crates and barrels, shouting out in languages he had never heard before. But Nate wasn't worried. He'd probably come into a different wharf this time. It shouldn't be hard to find where the merchant ships were docked. A thrill rushed through him as he left the waterfront, his boots clicking against the city's familiar cobblestone streets. He'd made it. But as he plunged into the city, his excitement drained away. Why were some of the streets deserted? Why were some of the streets blocked off by dirt walls? He saw no puppet shows, no ladies in swishing dresses, no fancy coaches clattering through the streets. Most of the stores were boarded up. On one block, the only people around were men, soldiers. Nate realized. He could tell they were American soldiers by their plain clothes. British soldiers were famous for their brass-buttoned red coats. That's where the name Redcoat came from. They wore spiffy leather hats, bright white shirts, and belts with brass buckles. American soldiers had no uniforms. Most of them wore cheap felt three-cornered hats and frontier shirts that tied at the collar. Those rebel soldiers looked like scarecrows, Storch had said. Looking around, Nate thought Storch wasn't far off. Most of the men wore dusty trousers and work shirts. Their weapons were beat-up muskets or rifles. The deeper into the city Nate walked, the more soldiers he saw. Most were hard at work, and at the end of the street, dozens of men were building another big dirt wall. Farther down, Nate saw 3 men pulling a cart carrying a huge cannon. What was happening here? The hairs on the back of Nate's neck prickled up. Nate suddenly remembered what Storch and Marston had been talking about yesterday as they ate their goose. Nate hadn't been paying close attention, but now Storch's words came back to him, as though he were right next to Nate, barking in his ear. The king sent hundreds of ships. The big battle is coming any day. Washington and his army of traitors will soon be crushed. Nate figured Storch and Marston had been talking about Boston. As far as he knew, that's where most of the fighting had been. But now Nate realized they must have been talking about New York City. No wonder the docks had been mostly empty. No wonder the streets were deserted. There had to be thousands of soldiers here. Most of the people living here must have left. And that's when Nate fully understood what he had done. He had escaped from Storch, and he'd landed smack in the middle of a war.